Changi Prison marks 90 years next year. The original complex where about 850 prisoners of war died during World War II is gone. But a new book revisits those days with letters from a former prisoner of war. The author, Thompson, is a relative of the POW and joins us in studio today. And to tell us why there is still so much interest in Changi's infamous past, we have Jeya Ayadurai, Director of Singapore History Consultants. Jeya, welcome to the program. Thanks so much for being here with me.
Thank you for having me.
So, Sally, let's start with you. You managed to obtain the letters of your uncle, who was a prisoner of war. Share with us, how did those letters end up in your hands?
My uncle was a prisoner of war. He was actually a civilian, but because he'd been a volunteer, he was put into a military camp. And he wrote love letters throughout his short life in prison to his wife, and he kept them in secretly under his bed. And when he died in a camp in northern Thailand on the death railway, a camp called Songkharai, he was lucky enough to have a very close friend who took them from his bed, kept them, and brought them back to England. And his mother sent them to my aunt, and she was able to read them. But they're very poignant and very loving.
Share with us, what was your initial reaction when you first read those letters? What made you decide to include them in the book?
I think they were so poignant, and because I was close to my aunt, Aunt Pen, his wife, I felt very strongly that all these letters and material I was gathering together should be included in the book. And he also wrote a diary.
And there were some stories or reflections from those letters that I'm sure still stick to you now. How do they tie into the title of your book, Never a Medal? Share with us.
They tie into the book because in one of his letters, he writes to Pen and says, "You will never get a medal for your courage and your bravery." And I wanted to write a book that justified and paid homage to all the thousands of people who gave service in their lives during the fall of Singapore. I wanted it to be recognized because I feel remembering anniversaries is a very important thing, and we should all do it.
These are very personal, very poignant stories, as you mentioned. Jeya, 90 years on, these stories are still very relevant to us. So why is the story of Changi Prison and the warriors still so significant for Singapore, especially in this age of AI and modernization?
Well, this year is the 80th anniversary of the end of war, and so many stories are still coming out of the woodwork. When you look at the contemporary relevance of history, and there is a contemporary relevance of history, Changi was important during the colonial years, it was important during the Second World War years, and in the post-war years. And when you look at Changi, while you can be a record of the pain and suffering that took place at the prison during the war years, when I was director of Changi for 18 years, what we also focused on was the amazing stories of bravery and courage and sacrifice that are also, I'm sure, reflected in the book. And in war, you see the worst in men. In war, you also see the nobility of men coming up, where people stand up for their fellow mates and to help them through really difficult times. We can also be inspired by stories of Singaporeans regarding Changi. For example, the angel of Changi, Mary Siao, who risked her life to feed POWs food, would smuggle food in. People like Elizabeth Choi, who tried to collect money and who was incarcerated after the Double 10 incident and was tortured, she and her husband, but they never gave up on helping others. And those stories are still relevant to us to inspire the next generation how to face adversity, how to have resilience despite the pain that you see in front of you.
And these stories are very important for the younger generation to be aware of as well, isn't it? And during the POW years from 1942 to 1945, we saw British and Australian soldiers imprisoned, right? And later, after the Japanese surrender, Japanese POWs themselves detained. In a sense, one man's liberation became another's incarceration, isn't it? So how do you think should Singapore interpret and reflect on that very complex chapter in that history?
Well, firstly, thank you for bringing up the point that the Japanese were in Changi too, and they suffered 2 years of incarceration because of the shortage of shipping to get them back to Japan.
Yeah.
But it's not, to just leave it at that is a little bit simplistic, because all the participants in the war were incarcerated at one point or the other. The largest group that were incarcerated, for example, were the Indian POWs, who were sent all across the South Pacific if they refused to join the INA, and suffered tremendous deprivation. And so you've got actually the story of many communities to tell, and that's important. And what's also important is that 8 years on, I'm leading a commemoration committee that has got many nations in it, and including the Japanese. And it's a wonderful story of reconciliation that after 80 years, on September 12th, we would have a ceremony at Kranji bringing all these countries together, recognizing the sacrifice made by soldiers, recognizing the pain that war brings, but also making sure that we remember those who had suffered, and that their stories should be told and they should be remembered.
As you said, these are stories of bravery, courage, and sacrifice. Sally, what more do you think you can share with us about your book, Never a Medal? Were there any particular discoveries or moments during your research that really left a deep impact on you?
I think my favorite part of doing the book was finding stories that were just very human. There was plenty of pain to read about, but I think one of my favorite stories is when there was a terrible famine at the end of the war in Sime Road camp, and everyone was hungry, but there was also something called the power of nicotine, which you've just been speaking of, and because there was hardly any money, they couldn't buy cigarettes. They had to make their own cigarettes. They had to roll their own cigarettes. And what they found was that the pages of the Bible made the most wonderful outer rim of the cigarette. Paperbacks weren't nearly so good because they were smelly. And they would fill these handmade cigarette rolls with human hair, with dried crickets, weevils, dried leaves, and they would smoke them. And my father confessed to it, and he was a thoracic surgeon, so he should not have been smoking at all. But he said, when you are so hungry, a cigarette helps take that feeling away.
Wow, that's quite a story, and thank you so much for writing this book. Really an important reminder of our early years. Thank you so much, Jeya. Thank you so much, Sally, for joining us in the studio tonight. That was Sally Thompson, author of a book on POWs, and Jeya Ayadurai from Singapore History Consultants.